Ba 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 bum bum ba 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 bum bum ba 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 boom 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 boom. Hello. Right, sorry, I couldn't resist. People keep talking about the singing, and well, it's occasionally going to be there. Let's see. A little quick discussion point before we get into today's long patrol. I hope you'll indulge me in it. There have been more conversations recently about the fact that I am quite so open, honest about my dyslexia as I am. And got permission from someone who they said I could talk about it as long as I talked about it in ways which cannot give too much information about them, which is fine. But they were pragmatically up until a couple of years ago. They're from the generation previous to me with dyslexia, and going through schooling, and they'd managed to leave school pretty much at 15, and pretty much as a functional illiterate, and managed to do 35 plus years in the workforce, in the construction industry, as a functional illiterate. Because of dyslexia. Because they thought about things differently. And talking to them reminded me of my own schooling, when I had some very nice teachers, but because they thought I was lazy with my handwriting, and that therefore I couldn't possibly be reading at the level I was doing, and I couldn't possibly, and they didn't know how I was speaking at the level I was speaking, because my writing was nowhere near enough, so I must be lazy or lying. And I used to ask about how to pronounce words. And they go, no, you don't need to know that. You don't need to know that yet. You don't need to know. And that meant some words I ended up sounding out in my head and coming up with pronunciations of based off what they were in my head, because the very people who I was supposed to be going to ask how to pronounce them were brushing me off for the nicest of reasons. I never believed there was anything sinister or nasty in it. They just didn't think it was there, and they thought it would make it easier on me for not have to deal with those words, I presume. My mum and dad were always helpful. Dad when he was around and in good dad mode. But there again, I love them dearly. But my dad was Scottish extraction family, Liverpudlian raised, Cambridge to an extent educated, lived round the world, picked up some very interesting accents and pronunciations along the way. Cason versus Cassian being one of them. My mum, Cornish and Scottish extraction, Somerset, a little bit of, raised mostly in Croydon with a little bit of Cockney accents thrown in as well, can speak like a regal queen when she wants to, can also sound like she's been living in deepest, darkest, furthest reaches of Cornwall for her whole life when she wants to. Again, I myself am a bit of a chameleon when it comes to wandering around the British Isles. I will be speaking English, but my linguistics and dialect will change to an extent to fit within the region, and I will be able to do a facsimile of being a local in quite a lot of them. Quite scary enough. I have had people look at me and sort of go, Is that you speaking? Yes. This is perfectly normal for me. So, the point I'm making is this. The reason I'm as open about my dyslexia and my own issues as I am is to both encourage people who have it, hopefully, to think, well, if he's done it, I'm smarter than he is, I can do even better. Because trust me, there are. Well, and secondly, so that other people, if they're dealing with people who have got those labels, or who they suspect have those labels, instead of maybe being nice and thinking, oh, he's never going to need that word, he's never going to need that, we'll go, well, hang on, there's Alex. He does use those words, and he's that. So yeah, I will answer that question. He might need it, or she might need it, or they might need it. I don't care about that. That's the point. So that is why I'm like this. Despite the fun it gives me with job applications in academia, but we'll leave that to one side. That was a fun interview this week. We'll leave that to one side, though. Anyway. I have Iron Brew. It's Friday the 4th of March. I'm recording this on. It's time for the Siege of Corfu Long Patrol. Now, in a rather interesting point of view, apparently I said the words 323 years ago today on 3rd of March when I was recording this. And of course it's 223 years ago. So, again, historian, not mathematician. So I did love some of the points that came out about that, yes. Historian, not mathematician. I do shamelessly use Excel spreadsheets and a few other things occasionally when I have to do maths. This one I was probably quite so worried about making sure I got the 23 right. I just did a 1700 off the 1700 off 2000. Without remembering, hang on, it should actually be 1800 functionally off 2000 for this one. Anyway, Hyder trip. Well, thank you to everyone who's donated to the Hyder trip. It is doing far better than I ever thought it would do. It's at £2,230, which honestly I never expected to get that high. I have things worked out for every level based on a £600 increase, because when I was working it out and setting it up, I found out that the rough amount you need to book into a ship to film it in Canada and America, roughly, that is from what I've been talking about, yeah, it seems to be roughly £600. That's me trying to say this without giving away commercial privilege data or anything like that. I'm not quite sure and don't want to get into too much details. But so that means sort of every certain amount by doing it, working out in £600 lots, that adds up to I can do another ship. Or that's enough for another couple of days, or 4 days in the hotel, or another 3 days in the hotel plus food, etc. Works out in the £600 chunks. And get food, fuel. People keep talking about book allowances, but that's why I work for Justin Craig. Wonderful company. Pay me the money that I need for my book addiction. And of course, Patreon. Thank you. Seeing those two groups, that keeps me going and it keeps me in books. So, yeah. Those are the targets. And thank you very much for all your support. The more we, as I said, the more there is there, the more targets I will attempt to do. And I'm already tempted to try to push back that date, but we'll see. Anyway, thank you. And now into the siege proper. So why does Corfu matter? Well, geography. It's that simple. We have the Aegean Sea here, the Ionian Sea, the Adriatic. We have much of the Eastern Mediterranean, off in that direction, on this map. And the Western Mediterranean isn't that far away. For a sailing navy, this is an absolutely critical spot where you can take on fresh water. It's where you can do so many other things which can really help you when it comes to maintaining ships. It is, in simple terms, infrastructure. And more importantly, it's infrastructure you can secure. Islands are like that. They come with a ready-made moat. And they tend to come with lots of cliffs as well, if you're lucky, which make for walls you don't really have to defend in the same way. You see, the dirty little secret about cliffs is if you have a decent cavalry unit wandering around, or gendarmerie, or dragoons, they can usually deal with the small parties of infantry, usually sailors, let's be honest, who might scale up the cliff to try and do some damage in your rear, or maybe open a gate or two. However, they still require a garrison, they still require defending, and the more important they are, usually means the more attractive they are to opponents, but also means the more they look costly they look. Because these islands are very rarely destinations in and of themselves. They don't have value in and of themselves. They have value in where they allow you to get to. They are the service station of the sailing world. And if we consider that, motorway service stations, that's a good model. We all have them, the ones that we don't mind stopping in. The ones that we think usually have decent food-ish. They have decent-ish loos, maybe decent accommodation, which isn't too bad, i.e. it's close enough to the road that you can get back on into the main road without too much trouble when you need to get moving on. But it's far enough away you don't have to listen to the HGVs rattle by all night long. Believe it or not, it's pretty similar when you're picking a good island for your base. There are 7 islands in a row in these sort of Ionian Islands, which are part of Venice's holdings. And without a doubt, Corfu is the most important of the lot. Yes, the others are all held by Venice, and they're all considered important by France, but when it comes to garrisoning them, both France and Venice have the same policy. Nice, 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 nice. We're all putting our troops there. Corfu. Most northerly. If you were looking at it from this sort of angle, you'd sit there and go, well, why that one? Why not some of the ones down here? Surely they have better positioning. They're further into the ocean. They're further. Well, it's quite simple, really. If you want to have an impact on Naples, that's a good base to work from. If you want to have an impact on the Ottoman, Ionian territories, that's a good space to work from. And if you want to block off the Adriatic from someone coming in to attack Venice, that's a good place to work from. Honestly, and I say this with deep abiding love in my heart for the Greek independence movement that set up Greece. But I'm always surprised Italy didn't make more of a try for Corfu and the Ionian Islands than it did. And more of a persuasive effort to try and woo them. Because if you have control of that island and you have control of Taranto, you then have very strong bases either side of the entrance to the Adriatic, and you can really control access. What's even funnier is that Austria accepts Venice in a treaty, which we'll get into in a second, and doesn't realize that thanks to their bases of ships at Toulon, as long as they have Corfu, at any point the French decide they want to strangle Venice and Trieste, all the harbours that Austria has on the Adriatic, all they need to do is put a fleet there. The equivalent of the M25 M1 service station. You want to block off those roads and make sure people can't use either of them. You stick a unit there. Oh. Anyway, so that's why Corfu matters, because in the Age of Sail terms, that is a service station sitting in the middle of, I don't know, Spaghetti Junction, if there was one. I think there is one off of Spaghetti Junction from memory. Not really that easy, but there is one. Anyway, the Treaty of Campo Formio. It's a treaty between France and Austria. Please note, it is between France and Austria. It's ending the War of the First Coalition. We ended. And yeah, it divides up the Republic of Venice. Now, as we're touching on the ending of Venice here, and as this is being recorded in 2022, in fact, the 4th of March 2022, when currently there are issues ongoing with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there have been a number of interesting analogies made with Venice. Because Venice, and I did mention this in the live, Venice gave up when the French were at the gates. They barely resisted. They ended up having to surrender after being laid siege to, etc. That is the reason they went into the night. That the Venetian Empire was gone, no more. I would love to say it was so simple, but it's history. It's not. Venice had been dying for a long time prior to that. The galleys, which had been the base of its navy, were no longer the primary weapon system, and they had to try and rebuild an entire set of infrastructure to support the galleons and ships of the line, which were the new things. The Portuguese and the Ottomans, thanks to the oceanic routes, had started wearing it down. The oceanic route for the Portuguese around South Africa, the overland route through Turkey and Istanbul into Europe that way, had been decimating their trade through the Levant. And this was even before the Dutch, and then the British, and even the French arrived. in India and in the Far East, cutting out the various middle persons. In simple terms, they had been dying for death by 1,000 cuts. And you can't live off past glories. Trouble is for Venice is that it's very good as a trading mercantile empire point. But it doesn't have the resources it needs to turn itself into an industrial powerhouse. Even in the Napoleonic era's terminology of industrialization, it's in trouble. And they kept fighting wars. Corfu have been besieged so many times. So many times by the Ottomans. It's just there'd been a siege of 1537, 1571, 1716. A catastrophe in 1718 is what they sometimes call it, where lightning strikes the powder magazine in the Castle de Mer, the Mer, or the old castle. It killed the Doge's brother at the time. The fact is, they had been fighting to defend them, to defend the islands and defend their empire for a long time. And it had stopped bringing in the returns, which allowed them to attract people. If you think about it, a city-state like Venice never has the population to sustain the armed forces they need for their operations. They might hire condottieri, they might hire more, have more even interesting arrangements where they basically hire allies, i.e., lords and nobles, who will lead who basically maintain a standing feudal army almost, and will hire that out to them, and they'll have their own service personnel, etc. But they might as well be German or Swiss, etc. So they have a problem. They have to hire in people. They have to hire in muscle to have enough muscle to man all the things they need to have people in. Simply put, Venice is not Ukraine. Ukraine is not Venice. Venice had been worn down to the point at which, by the time Napoleon's troops turn up at the gates, the ones who are running the war, the ones who are leading the fight, are the widows who are marching along the walls and trying to rally the troops and keep everything going. Because all the warriors, all the leaders who could be leading them are dead or dying. The widows do their best. But the trouble is, it's going to sound terrible, but when you're leading an army where your veterans and your experience and your core personnel are mostly people there who are there for a wage, not for love of country, well, they might well decide that they don't want to do the fighting because they're there for a paycheck, not to die. No one signs up to die. But there's the level of risk they'll accept. There's dealing with the Ottomans. Okay. Fine, that's almost like a crusade. There's dealing with a fellow Christians. And also there's the usual view of the view of some people of versus the quality of the Ottoman troops. Well, there's different views of the Ottoman troops versus the Ottoman Janissaries, the levies versus the Janissaries in their qualities. That like there are differing views of units in the various armies. If you tell people the Imperial Guard is marching on you, you have a very different view of your likelihood of survivability versus the regular French troops. And it's kind of similar with the expectations of what the Janissaries would bring to a fight versus the regulars, or rather the levies. But these are some of the problems Venice is facing. And it's been going on for a long time. Centuries by this point, of a downward spiral. So, at this point, it's the end. Is the end. It's over. And Venice is of so little value by this point. Economically, infrastructure-wise, in every sense. The French don't want it. The French have won it. But they literally sign everything over to the Austrians. Basically, they're buying peace with the Austrians by giving them Venice, which was theoretically at one point one of Austria's own allies. There are people who say the French come off worse than this. I'm not sorry. No. It's the Austrians. That I do not know how they do this, but I have to give them big props. They go through history. And the amount... They're kind of like the British, who go through history and do all sorts of nasty, horrific things. They really do. And yet, the abiding perception of people, and especially when you're looking at people's estimates of British intelligence, etc., is that we are bumbling gentlemen who are all nice and wouldn't do anything underhand or nasty. You sit there and go, have you actually read a history book of Britain? And I'm talking an accurate history book. You know, some of our great stories, which are these great parts of British national identity and things, these wonderful things we've done, daring do raids, if you look at them from the other side, are not particularly nice, and that's fine. That's history. That's the nature often of heroics. From one side, you're a hero. On the other side, you're an evil mass murderer. El Draco, i.e. Drake. Good example. How is he considered in Spain versus how is he considered in the UK? There's the mix. So, we have that. But that's not the only thing we have to think about. With Austria, as I said, going back to Austria tends to get ignored. And yet, here they are accepting their ally as compensation so they'll have peace with the French. And yet they're still the nice people. And then people in the World War, people are shocked in World War I, I'm going, oh, look at what the Austrians did. No. The Austrians are just as scary as any other European power, and just as out for their own interests. And there's nothing wrong with that. Anyway, interesting enough, the idea what the French had behind getting control of the Ionian Islands was access to the Eastern Mediterranean, ability to deal with the Austrians, and re-establishing the Levant trade, which of course had been so undermined by British, Dutch, and Portuguese and Ottoman efforts that it had pragmatically ceased to exist, which had been what caused Venice's problems. But therefore, the French thought if they could re-establish it, that would in turn undermine the British and Dutch economy, specifically the British one. It didn't work. And the British got the Ottomans and the Russians, who were busily beating each other up, instead go and attack them. Kill. War of the Second Coalition. Well, the first coalition happens, and then the second coalition happens. And one of the interesting things about this lovely map is it shows theoretically all the important things. And Corfu is the only Ionian island which is actually named. You can see it's mentioned there. It's just a little written there, Corfu. Sit there and go, why does Corfu matter? You can look there and see why Malta would matter. Yeah, Malta's pretty darn useful. Crete. Yeah, I can see why that would matter. Cyprus, not quite sure, but why does Corfu matter? Because if I'm trying to supply Russian and Austrian and Ottoman and any other forces operating in Italy, then having Corfu and access to the Adriatic is very useful. It makes a difference. It's always nice to have control of access. Put another way, Corfu could be said to be the Gibraltar of the Adriatic, but it can also be said to be a Malta equivalent if you are France. So it's incredibly useful for the French. It's also just as useful for the Russians, and the Russians will end up operating out there for a while, because the Russians want an access port, a nice base for their fleet, to project power into the Mediterranean, which is a crucial trade route from them. Remember, their all-year-round ports are all in the Black Sea. They're all the other side of the Dardanelles. Which means for them, the Ottoman Empire is a massive risk. If the Ottoman Empire, or modern Turkey, decides that it's going to block off Dardanelles to their warships, then they can't get them anywhere. They have their best port and best facilities sitting there, and they can't use them. It's a problem. But please also note that that territory is the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, not Russia. Crimea had been its own sultanate for quite a while, not until sort of that quite recently. And the Russo-Ottoman Alliance was a rather interesting occasion. In fact, the Crimea had only been annexed by Russia in 1787. Catherine II decided to make a procession through what was called New Russia, which was the territory they'd taken in large chunks of area, which should be added on to the empire. And along with their ally, the then Holy Roman Emperor, Joseph II, had annexed Crimea. Well, this led to the Russo-Turkish War of 1787 to 1792, where pretty much they knocked several bells out of each other several times over. And it wasn't particularly nice. With the Ottomans trying to charging up through their Ionian Empire and up through their territories, and the Russians coming down, and various other nations getting involved as they so wished. At one point, the Holy Roman Empire and the Russians and Montenegro as well were deploying some region of 120,000 soldiers. There are estimates to how many are killed. I believe casualties and losses are up to 76,000 killed. So that would be pretty horrendous if true. But the Ottomans, well, they committed roughly 300,000 troops, and they ended up with roughly 130,000 killed. So, according to some estimates, but that was a very nasty war, and that was not the first of the Russo-Turkish wars. In fact, the Russo-Turkish wars have been an ongoing thing. Even more fun, at the same time as there is the Russo-Turkish war going on, there is also the Russo-Swedish war of 1788 to 1790, which was another thing going on at that point. So Russia does like its two-front wars, i.e. to be both attacking Sweden and to be attacking, well, basically taking large chunks of Black Sea coast. Was what they were aiming for. Anyway, the great hero of this war was Fyodor Ushkov, who was probably one of the most successful admirals of all time. He is credited with taking charge and leading 43 naval battles, being involved in 43 naval battles with commander ships, etc., as a fleet, and he never lost a single ship and never lost a battle. Which is a pretty big thing. And this is the guy chosen to lead the formations that they're putting together in the fleet. So basically the Russian equivalent of Nelson. Ushkov. And yes, I do find it slightly disturbing that he's gone from having a Kirov, renamed for him, the nuclear-powered, for want of a better phrase, battle cruiser, to having a sovereignty-class destroyer. I think they could have at least gone with one of the new frigates. He deserves at least one of the new ships. Something new and techie looking. But well, here is the gentleman in question. He would serve with the Russian Navy from 1766 to 1812. He would die in 1817, age 72. When he was, of course, in this campaign, he was 53, 54. Which meant that's a fairly good age for this period to go on campaigning. He's got a lot of experience behind him. Seriously, by this point, he had 32 to 33 years experience in the Navy. And he knows what he's doing. And he served all around. By this point, he'd served in the War of the Second Coalition, of course, but the Siege of Corfu, but he'd also served in all the previous operations for the Russian Navy. Turkish War of 76, Russo-Turkish War of 76-84, the 87 to 92 one, and several skirmishes in between. He's a very skilled admiral. The Russian fleet under him is distinguished by three things. One, if I find another list, and I have found even more lists of potential ships which were under his command, I will start crying. I am searching for, I have been told after doing the live, that there is, in English, because as good as my Cyrillic is, it's not probably good enough for this level. In English, there is a book like this, which is the history of admirals of the Russian Navy. I've been told it exists. No one's told me what the title is or what the ISBN is number. So I'm going to say, if you know of it, and if you do know where it is, please tell me. I will go hunt down a copy. So far, my Google foo has not been able to provide it. We know he was an inveterate trainer. He believed officers and sailors needed to know what they were doing. He didn't appreciate officers who wouldn't do things like guard the mast or know what they were doing when it was sailing a ship, but that was not a good way to survive in Ushkov's navy. And he was someone who certainly promoted on merit. Now, there is a reason for that. He had to always be slightly careful because he comes from minor nobility, which was occasionally a contentious position to be in. He rose through merit and through success, self-recognized and all these things, gets his position bedded in, but he's always, to an extent, a person who's there because he can be, because of what he's achieved, and because he's useful. Now, this eventually actually does get him a bit into trouble with the king, the Tsar, because, well, the Tsar towards the end of his career, because Alexander I, the Emperor of Russia, is slightly jealous of him and worried about what he might achieve. So many victories. It's kind of like one of the Georges turning around to Nelson and going, "Oh, you've been so successful. You could challenge me for my throne. I will now take you from the navy and try and put you in a backwater post, keep you away from getting victories." You can imagine what St. Vincent, etc., would have said about that. My lord, are you really quite sure? But there's a difference in the British system versus the Russian at this point. The British system was still quite competency heavy. The Russian system was, well, an admiral like Ushkov only got ahead by one of two ways. He made sure he won battle, so he made sure all his subordinates had to be up to their job, because if they weren't, they could let him down and then he could lose a battle, so he had to make sure they trained hard. Or alternatively, he made sure all his subordinates were very rich, very noble people who would tell all the court how wonderful he'd been and how impressive he was in order to garner themselves positive attention, even if he lost. Those are your options. One is the good political approach, one is the good patriotic approach. Pushkov did the patriotic approach. And he really did build his fleet up. The quality of sailors, the quality of the ships under his command were massive in terms of their times. Would I say they're the equivalent of the Royal Navy? No. But I would say they're probably the equivalent of the Dutch. And the Dutch aren't far off the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy have a huge mass of that capability on their side. That's their advantage. The Dutch have the capability, but they always have it in a smaller number and a smaller strength, really. It's the same with the Russian fleet. The forces under Ushkov's command and a few others certainly do reach the quality of the Dutch, but the trouble is the overall fleet is not quite there. And it's because they don't have the opportunity of it. Again, if we go back to this lovely map, where's the Russian Navy going to get massive sailing experience? And look at how large the land borders are. Their army's always going to come first. The Ottoman fleet's even more of an interesting thing. Said by a guy called Vice Admiral Kadir Bey, or Kapitan Abdul Kadir Bey, which is the Ottoman way of pronouncing it. And even less is known about what ships are there. Honestly, one of the things I find most strange about Corfu is that for many of the battles in the Russo-Turkish War, etc., and the various Russo-Turkish wars, there'll be another one, another Russo-Ottoman War, they are listed. But the Siege of Corfu, there are so many different listings. What we know overall is that the fleet strength, not at the beginning, but from about a month in, hovers usually somewhere in the region of 12 ships of the line and 11 frigates, with usually it being 50-50 ships of the line from the two allies, and the frigate numbers usually staying roughly 50-50, but sometimes going, well, 7-4 in one direction, but 7-4 in the other direction, it seems. This is what I'm based off the list that I've seen. At various points, there are approximately, and I say this is approximate, there are Russian troops taken with the fleet. There is a debate as to how many, which is why I put approximately 2,000. We know approximately they have 4,000 Ottoman troops to come on. But also you have the sailors, and there is a debate with the Russian troops as whether or not some of those personnel are being used as Marines or even sailors aboard ships, whilst actually being soldiers, and whether or not the sailors actually did double duty. So this is the rough war things. And yes, if you feel like crying at this confusion, you're not the only one. The French commander, Louis-Francois Jean Chabot, who, honestly, you couldn't feel more sorry for if you tried. The French have been administering the Ionian Islands since they claimed them under the treaty system, but they hadn't been doing a good job. They managed to upset everyone, and I mean everyone. To say he's a mediocre commander given an absolutely impossible task is to overplay his level. He's a distinctly average. Mediocre might be a bit over the top and underestimate the task. He's got, well, in theory, he has 3,500 soldiers, 2 ships of the line, and a frigate to defend against somewhere in the region of 6,000 plus soldiers, 12 ships of the line, and 11 frigates. Now, yes, he has fortifications, and yes, that includes 650 guns in Corfu and 5 artillery batteries on the island of Vido and all these things. This is Napoleonic France we're talking about. That era. He hasn't got the best troops by any stretch of imagination. He's got an island which has been, well, let's put it this way. So the people who were pro the French thought that they were going to bring in democracy, liberty, freedom. Actually, what they brought was a guillotine and a penchant for doing nasty things to anyone who disagreed with them. They also managed to upset the Greek Orthodox Church and the priests by making them wear a cockade in their hat. There are things in life which are there are. I can see a logic behind in it, but there's a case in, how do I put this? if you're going to upset a lot of people and cause yourself a lot of trouble to administer it, and not gain anything from doing it, then such superficial changes and enforcement and rulings do not do you any good. They'd also managed to upset, surprisingly being the French, mostly ruling classes on the islands. And they'd also managed to upset them in terms of there kept being an idea that they were potentially going to try and give away territory which the islands claimed on the mainland to the Ottomans. Which, of course, most of the population of the islands had been fighting for years to maintain against the Ottomans. Now, this was actually probably more Ali Pasha, who was the Ottoman ruler in that particular Ionian area, and possibly the Catholic Archbishop, but it's still, and I say this with a lot of love in my heart for all this scenario, an understanding. Not the way to run the islands. Oh, and they were also bankrupt before even he arrived. Both him and gentlemen who were supposed to be helping with administering civil affairs spent a lot of their time going around trying to collect money in loans before they even reached the islands. The trouble is, even with that, they were never enough. They're using the Venetian defences, which are designed in many ways on the getting freedom, for a far larger, more capable garrison and a far more supportive population than what the French were dealing with. You know, when the Venetians were being besieged by the Ottomans, they had the population on side. The locals were helping to man the walls. The locals were helping to defend the castles, to defend the fortifications, to defend Corfu. The French didn't have that. The French disarmed the locals because they were worried about them rising up against them. At one point, they actually had a fight over it. Most advantageous ship, a third rate, the General Route. Would, as so many third rates do, end up in service of the Royal Navy. Although, to be fair, she is acquired by the Royal Navy in 1800. In the Battle of the Malta Convoy. These things happen. So she gets away this time. In a turn up for the books, HMS Leander, the Leander, which was a fourth rate, which was there, well, really sort of heavy frigate. She is captured by the French, by actually the General, taken to, wanders around, taken to Corfu. She will be recaptured in the operation by the Russians, who then give her back to the British. That's how you make friends. Return the ships to your enemy. The rare ship that the French actually captured off the British. And here is the old fortress. It is gorgeous and frankly colossal. The old fortress really is something special. It's when you look at some of these sort of drawings and the pictures of it, you realize quite how big and how much of a statement it is. It has been around for a long time. It starts being built in the early 15th century. Is when we start to date it from, but really the major construction you can see is 1545 to 1555 and the 1720s. Then we have the new fortress, slightly later, built 1572 and also modernized and upgraded in the 1720s. Yes, This took part in a fair number of sieges of Corfu. The diagram in the corner is actually the 1688 diagram, although it had the later editions of the Red Fort added on, and the Scaponus Bastion in terms of green added on, which was added in 1728. It's a strong place to defend. In fact, once we start to look at Corfu, it really does become obvious it's a bit of a freaking nightmare to try and take. But there's a problem with manning all that. All that requires personnel. All that requires numbers. And those are something that, of course, poor Koa doesn't have. Chabot just doesn't have the numbers. You can tell that because this lovely little island, Vido, key to Corfu, has 500 troops put on it. And 5 batteries of guns to defend it. It hadn't been fortified really by the Venetians, probably because they always presumed that if necessary their galleys, etc., could come tearing down the Adriatic and could lead a counter-assault on it if they wanted to. But also, they had the whole island supporting them. And there's a difference to how you operate when you have the whole island supporting you than when you are basically held up in Corfu because you've managed to piss off everyone else on the island. And so you're basically held up in the capital city trying to defend yourself. That is what they found themselves doing. They found themselves behind some very nice fortifications, some very strong fortifications, without the numbers to hold them, without numbers to hold the island across the way from them, and without the support they needed from a fleet. In simple terms, the French were outnumbered, outgunned, and outpositioned. And to give you the exact example of the siege, what happens is that on the 4th of November, Ushkov turns up, first of all with 3 ships of the line and 3 frigates, and some smaller ships to basically begin the siege and scout out the area. The Turkish squadron then turns up, and then another squadron under Dmitry Severin. Later on, Rear Admiral Pavel Pushkin also turns up with more ships. And by November, the 13th of November, by December actually, of 1798, fleet was pretty much from that point onwards continually 12 ships of the line and 11 frigates. Again, along with smaller ships as well. It was January 26th when Generu managed to, with sails painted black, sneak out and sail to Ansonia. And it was in February that the 4,000 Ottoman troops arrived. It was now with overwhelming numbers, on the 28th of February, 1799, that the troops were landed on Vido. Leander and Brun, a little frigate, corvette from the French, tried to intervene, but were damaged and forced to retreat to the protection of batteries at Corfu. And then 2,000 troops were landed on Vido, and after a roughly 2-hour battle, the island was taken. They'd actually reinforced the island's garrison up to 800 personnel, to include people manning the batteries, but also some extra troops were sent as well. And of those 800, 200 were killed, 400 were taken prisoner, including the commandant of the island, Brigadier General Pivon, and 150 of the troops managed to swim to Corfu. The Ottomans lost 180 killed and wounded. The Russians, 130 killed and wounded. So you can say they did quite well in that one. Once Vito fell, well, on the 1st of March, the island's batteries opened fire on the city's forts, along with Russian shore batteries and some of the Russian and Turkish warships, which are now being finally put into position. The Allies then stormed the outlying forts of San Rocco, San Salvador, and San Adrian, which aren't really visible on this map, but aren't that far away. On the 2nd of March, Ushkov plans to assault the main forts, but French envoys come out, request a 48-hour armistice, and on the 3rd of March, they surrender. And that's it. That is it. Leander is returned to the Royal Navy. Ushkov gets presented with another medal, the Order of St. Alexander Nevsky, which, well, which I don't think is still in circulation for some reason in Russia. I can't think why it didn't survive, but it's a cool medal to get. However, things don't stop there, because the islands are still valuable. The siege is over. They've won it. Woohoo! We're all so happy for you. But the problem is, yes, you've got the sea, you've got control of the islands, now what are you going to do with them? Well, they start off by trying to basically set up a joint protectorate, which is the Titular Republic, or the Seven Islands Republic. Flag up top. But the British only managed to stop them going to war with each other for a few years, and by 1806, the Russians and the Ottomans are beating seven bells out of each other again over control of, well, let's be honest, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and pretty much most of southeastern Europe. And some areas of the Caucasus. And of course Constantinople, or Istanbul, depending on which side you're on and what you're planning on calling it at that time, so you can make claims to it, because you must remember the Russian Orthodox Church occasionally gets these ideas that it should be it is the inheritor of the Orthodox Church, and therefore it should protect and control the most holy city in the Orthodox religion. Jerusalem is always slightly too far away and slightly more difficult to get to, but rulers of the Russian Empire occasionally come to the conclusion, the starting idea, that they are destined to turn the Hagia Sophia once more into an Orthodox cathedral. Anyway, leaving that particular vision of problems aside, this does not create a good island atmosphere for the islands. And the British get worried the French are going to slip back in. So the British managed to get it agreed to be their protectorate in 1815 under the Peace of Paris. And whilst they have some issues, they don't have a completely sailing at smooth sailing time. They hand over a fairly intact set of islands to the Greeks in 1864. At which point, King George I of Greece is weighing up the fact that he's got the islands back for Greece, which means he's great. He has restored them to Greek territory to Greece. But he's also got a lot of politicians who are successors and inheritors of parties which were upset by the lack of democracy they were given under the French when they promised democracy, which were upset by the treatment of their various constituents, and which are fiercely proud of the democracy and of the political institutions they've built in in the what is called, with only a little schadenfreude by the British, the United States of the Ionian Islands. Yes, I'm fairly sure that was some epic trolling going on there when the British were naming that one. You're the United States of America. Meet the United States of the Ionian Islands. They're our protectorate. There is something going on there. Anyway, leaving that to one side. It's an interesting inheritance for poor George I, who was not perhaps the most able or smartest of options for ruling Greece, but he tried. You can certainly say that he tried. So the ultimate legacy of them? Well, the problem is, the reason the British want them is to stop the French having a base in the Eastern Mediterranean. But the British don't want to help them by re-establishing the trade routes through the Levant, which would make them prosper again, because the British trade goes around the world. Even when the British, of course, build the Suez Canal, mainly steamships coming through, which aren't going to need to stop or be moved by the wind and have to go up to the outside of the Mediterranean, then down again. No, they're just going to plod along. So the island's economies really did suffer, and they really didn't get the investment they needed, but also it's hard to justify the investment when there's going to be very little return on it. And that's ultimately the problem for these islands. These days, they have a very fine reputation as a holiday spot, and I can honestly say, go there and look at the forts, look at the history of them. We talk about the sieges of Malta, we talk about the great battles fought there, but there is just as much as in Corfu. I know people talk about it as basically a beach resort where you go and you sit on the beach. That's all you do. But there is so much history there. I personally haven't been, but I have a friend who is obsessed with medieval history to the extent that I'm obsessed with naval history. And she has got so many selfies and videos and pictures of going around those castles. I mean, so many. She has gone to all 7 islands. I think she has returned there at least once a year, every year for the last 15 years, other than during COVID. It's looking forward to get back in there this year. And yeah, it's wonderful history, and it's really well preserved, and it's really nice to go around, and it's good weather apparently as well. And if you do fancy a swim in the sea, it's pretty decent apparently. Anyway, again, according to the same friend, she takes her sister. Sister's view of a holiday is very different to ours. I think they go because it allows them to both do their own thing and be happy. So, what have we got coming up? Well, on Monday we have the Königsberg class. Woohoo! That's not Monday, that's Tuesday. And we have 2 lives this week. We have the Battle of Agitis and Operation Town Number 2. That's Thursday and Friday. So that will come out as a long patrol on Saturday. And that will come out as a long patrol on the Monday. So that will come out on the 12th as a long patrol. And that will come out on the 14th as a long patrol. It'll be fun. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and thank you again.